Overnight on the 20th to the 21st of November 1942, the 534th Regiment of the 384th Infantry Division was sent to the Verkhney Buzinovka area to reinforce the new line that the 6th Army was building. 48th Panzer Corps also ordered Roth's 22nd Panzer Division to move south and form a line along the rivers in this area to avoid encirclement. But when it had done that, it received a new mission to advance northeast to rescue Group Lascar. So, moving back north, it found that the 1st Tank Corps had moved south and dug in, blocking them. Filipenko's Tank Brigade had also caught up with the 26th Tank Corps at Perelazovsky, making this a formidable obstacle for the 22nd Panzer Division. And by this point, Operation Uranus was already 36 hours behind schedule, and Stalin and the Stavka were demanding that everything be done to keep it going. To them, 1st Tank Corps needed to disengage from the 48th Panzer Corps, otherwise it would disrupt the entire plan. And Kravchenko's 4th Tank and Plev's 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps needed to slip around the Axis line and move towards the Don. This had to happen before Huber's 14th Panzer Corps reached the area and formed a solid line, otherwise they may be stopped from getting to Kalach. Huber had 110 panzers in total, although they were scattered over a wide area at this time, so if they were able to concentrate, this would be a significant threat to the Soviet offensive. Therefore, Romanenko ordered Butkov to disengage and complete his original objective. Zhukov's 89th Tank Brigade stayed behind, but the rest of 1st Tank Corps bypassed the 22nd Panzer Division, moved south and captured the state farms on the Kirtlach River. And Rodin's corps raced south too. Romanenko had told Rodin to get a move on, and so he did. 26th Tank Corps rolled into the area south of Kalmykov, and in the process of this move, General Dumitrescu pulled his headquarters all the way back to the town of Morozovsk, which was miles away. And suffering from the counterattacks of the 14th Panzer Division, the 5th Guards Cavalry Division bypassed the German strongpoint of Verkhney Buzinovka and advanced southeast towards the town of Nizhnaya Buzinovka. 2 companies of Romanian infantry defended it, but they were easily routed, and the Soviets captured 7 tanks, 17 vehicles, and several warehouses in the town. Huber then entered Golubinsky and informed Paulus that, despite fuel shortages, the 24th and 16th Panzer Divisions would reach their designated positions along the Liska River during the afternoon or early evening. Paulus then ordered Huber to attack the flanks of the Soviet mobile groups, and it was now a race to see if the Germans could bring up enough forces to block the route to Kalach. Yet, as surprising as it sounds, up until this point, the 6th Army was actually optimistic about the situation in the west, going so far to say that it was the 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps that was the main threat. Late in the morning, however, the picture became increasingly clear. Von Weichs warned Paulus for the first time that his army was threatened on both flanks, and it was then discovered that 4th Tank Corps was heading towards the Don, south of 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps. Paulus and Schmidt at last recognised that the enemy was aiming for a full encirclement. Sweeping aside Romanian rear service troops, Kravchenko captured the town of Sukhanovsky along with 5th Guards Cavalry Division. 24th Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe Don had fought to retain it, but were forced back to the east as Kravchenko took more villages as well. 4th Tank Corps had lost 16 tanks, but had captured 550 enemy vehicles, an airfield with 25 aircraft, and several warehouses, one of which had a store of 150 heavy Maxim machine guns. Then, catching up, Rodin's forces sped towards the Don, reaching the Liska River after darkness fell. Filipenko's 19th Tank Brigade rolled into the village of Plesistovsky, and the Axis rear service units there fled in complete panic. So panicked, in fact, that they left behind 300 Red Army prisoners who insisted on joining Filipenko's ranks. The brigade also captured a maintenance workshop, 2 warehouses with food and clothing, 400 vehicles and 300 motorcycles. Back in the west, the 22nd Panzer Division was caught in a stalemate with the 2 Soviet cavalry divisions and their supporting tanks. Neither side could really do much, but this ultimately benefited the Soviets as Rort failed to strike northeast to help the Romanians. To the west, the 21st Cavalry Division and 8th Guards Tank Brigade joined the 159th Rifle and 14th Guards Rifle Divisions and pushed the Romanian 9th Infantry Division back to the Krivaya River. The advancing cavalrymen were mostly on tanks rather than horses and overran the 9th Division's headquarters, forcing them to flee in disorder. The riflemen also reached the river by the end of the day, encircling an entire Romanian regiment on the way. To the east, Danilov's 119th Rifle Division moved southward along the Zaritsa to the Zirki area against the Romanian 1st Armoured Division. Georgi was ordered to strike towards the 22nd Panzer Division and believed that the Germans were advancing towards him, so he left some of his force to resist the 119th Rifle Division and then moved southwest over the Zaritsa River. They were then blocked by elements of the 5th Tank Army, with another 20 of its R2 tanks being wiped out in the process. Worse, this move opened up a gap in the lines, granting the Soviets a golden opportunity to encircle Group Lascar. The 124th Rifle Division pushed the Romanian 5th Division east, and Colonel Belov's 50th Guards Rifle Division with the 216th Tank Brigade in support clawed their way towards Golovsky, overrunning and seizing most of the logistical services of the Romanian 6th and 13th Infantry Divisions in the process. The 6th Division was only lightly engaged at this point and so sent a detachment with Bofors guns to defend the town. The good news was that the eastern flank of Group Lascar held firm against the 333rd Rifle Division, which also attacked towards Golovsky. But the bad news was that the 277th Rifle Division slipped south of the Kirtlac River and linked up with the 119th Rifle Division, so Group Lascar was finally trapped in its pocket. Zooming out a little, it's clear that Romanenko's forces had made better progress compared to the previous days, and the threat to Kalach and 6th Army's supply lines was significant for the first real time since Operation Uranus began. 14th Panzer Corps' main defence line had been bypassed, and Paulus and Army Group B's hope that Huber could stabilise the situation and maybe even counterattack was fading. Their western flank was now in serious trouble. But the Soviets were still well behind schedule. Butkov should have been here on the first day, and Rodin still hadn't taken his second day's objective. This is a testament to the German and Romanian units who had resisted more stubbornly than expected. And there was still a potential for the Germans to delay or maybe even stop the Soviets from reaching Kalach. The 16th Panzer Division was at the Don River, and more elements from the 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions were moving in from the east, along with Kampfgruppe von Hanstein, which contained parts of the 3rd and 60th Motorised Divisions. And more infantry elements were being organised too. So victory could still be taken away from the Soviets if they didn't get to Kalach immediately. It was this evening that General Dumitrescu requested permission for Group Lascar to break out of the trap it was in. Army Group B's commander, von Weichs, supposedly repeated Hitler's order of the previous day and refused to allow a retreat. Except he didn't, because Hitler didn't order Lascar to stand fast the previous day, as I explained last episode. He only ordered it to stand on this day. But I'm now wondering if this was actually von Weichs playing the madman get out of jail free card. Did von Weichs reject Dumitrescu's request and then later blame his failure on Hitler? Maybe so. But either way, it was too late to either save Lascar or order him to break out. And regardless, Dumitrescu ignored von Weichs and secretly ordered General Lascar to make preparations for a breakout. Plus, Lascar had already started to do this himself anyway. So the stand-fast orders are a moot point anyway because the Romanians acted on their own initiative. And interestingly, Halfer later suggested that this may have undermined the determination of the encircled divisions and precipitated their collapse, but it is unlikely to have altered their ultimate fate. So yes, prematurely ordering your troops to break out of a pocket might cause troop morale to collapse, something to bear in mind later when we're talking about the 6th Army. And far from helping them in their breakout, Army Group B had little choice but to order the 48th Panzer Corps to fall back, which it was being forced to do anyway by the pressure of the Soviet offensive. If catastrophe was in the air in Romanian circles, a sense of impending doom began to grip 6th Army's headquarters late on the 21st of November. Given that day's disturbing events, there was no denying the perils facing the army at this juncture. While one disaster was playing out in the west, to the south of Stalingrad, a catastrophe was unfolding. By this point, a massive gap had been torn between the German 4th and Romanian 6th Army Corps, and 3 Romanian divisions had been wiped out, with another being partly overrun and the rest forced to fall back. The only saving grace was that the 29th Motorised Division had counterattacked, but this had only achieved limited success, and the overall situation for the Germans was dire. For the Soviets, things were looking really good. The Romanians in the pocket at Lake Sarpa surrendered overnight, and the Soviets captured 2,500 soldiers as a result. 29th Motorised Division was causing them trouble, trying to help the Romanian 20th Infantry Division as best it could, and Shumilov's forces barely went anywhere thanks to the 29th Motorised and 297th Infantry Divisions. But the only reason Laser was seeing any success was because the 13th Tank Corps was overextended and didn't have its full force facing the Germans. So, when the 17th Mechanised Brigade, with the 44th Tank Regiment, and the 62nd Mechanised Brigade, with the 163rd and 176th Tank Regiments, plus even more tank elements, arrived to take on the 29th Motorised Division, which they did on the 21st, the situation turned against the Germans. The 163rd Tank Regiment strolled into the sights of the 129th Panzer Battalion, and a battle broke out that lasted for hours. Both sides took heavy losses, although German records are lost for this action. It's thought that the Soviets had 9 T-34s and 4 T-70s knocked out, while the Germans wrote off 6 Panzers, with possibly more damaged. Nonetheless, the Germans were forced to retreat. Despite the fog and snow, and the reliance on the compass once more, other Soviet units had begun to outflank the 29th Motorised Division, prompting 4th Army Corps, now transferred to the 6th Army, to order Laser's forces to begin withdrawing to more secure defensive positions, which they started that evening. A small Kampfgruppe of pioneers and other elements left the main part of the division and headed for Zeti. And although some authors have concluded that 29th Motorised Division was stopped in the middle of a victorious counterattack, the reality was that the situation had gotten completely out of hand. To the south, the 36th Mechanised Brigade continued its assault on Plodavite, with Rodinov's brigade slipping around the flank of the village and compelling the defenders to fall back. Volsky's corps then proceeded westwards, followed by the 126th Rifle Division, while the 302nd Rifle Division moved south towards Tundatovo. The 60th Mechanised Brigade went towards Tingota Station, capturing an entire regiment from the disintegrated Romanian 2nd Infantry Division as it did. The 59th Mechanised Brigade took the 74th Kilometre Station before moving on to seize Zeti at 1700 hours. They also captured 500 Romanians, but decided to wait the night instead of pushing on, which would have consequences the next day. And the 36th Mechanised Brigade with the 55th Tank Regiment took Abganerova Station, along with the 4th Cavalry Corps' 81st Cavalry Division, which had caught up to them. Abganierova itself fell to the 61st Cavalry Division, which captured 600 Romanians in the process, as the 6th Romanian Army Corps' only reserve, a small mechanised unit, tried to counterattack. This was partly encircled and then annihilated, with the 6th Corps basically disintegrating at this point. There was nothing left to stop Trofanov moving on to his objectives, so the cavalry units continued southwestwards, threatening the rear and flank of the 4th Romanian Division to the south. Thus, by the evening of the 21st, Romanian lines were non-existent, and the southern flank of the 6th Army was looking vulnerable. Most of the remaining Romanian formations had also lost their heavy weapons and equipment in the retreat, and there was a shortage of both fuel and ammunition. The 4th Romanian Infantry Division was the only complete infantry division left. One infantry regiment from the 1st Romanian Infantry Division had managed not to get encircled and was now defending Tundodovo, and the cavalry divisions of the 7th Corps were moving to form a new line, but that was it. There was nothing else left. If Manstein was going to counterattack and reach Stalingrad from this area, which he would attempt to do, then Hott would have to find units to fill the gap, and he'd have to do so quickly. The massive gap in the lines was also why Hott, or von Weichs, it's not clear which, ordered the 29th Motorised Division to withdraw to the northwest, into the forming Stalingrad pocket. And I want to point this out because the 29th Motorised Division didn't have to fall back into the Stalingrad pocket. It had the choice to just go west or southwest. But, because there were no other units to plug the southern flank of the 6th Army, it was ordered north, and this was a good thing for Paulus. Had the 29th Motorised Division not gone north, then he wouldn't have had a strong division capable of leading the breakout of the Stalingrad pocket. So the only chance for Paulus to ever break out came because the 29th Motorised Division had been sent north. However, a counter-argument to this is that had the 29th Motorised Division gone south, then Hott and Manstein would have had an extra division to strike towards the 6th Army with, which potentially could have allowed them to get to Paulus. Of course, it's doubtful that one extra division could have made such a difference, but I just wanted to offer an alternative opinion from the usual narrative. But yes, even though some have suggested the 29th Motorised Division didn't have a chance of stopping Eremenko's attack, and arguably did the right thing in falling back to the north. It is worth considering the fact though that one motorised division did have an impact on the Soviet offensive, and that the 48th Panzer Corps, with one Romanian armoured division and one weak German Panzer division, managed to delay the offensive by maybe a day or so. If then the Axis divisions had been at full strength, or if they had, let's say, an extra division or two behind the Romanian lines, it's not unreasonable to assume that the Soviet offensive may have been derailed or delayed enough so that the German commanders could have reacted to events. But then again, the German commanders were reacting to events, as we're about to see. Hott's headquarters was directly in the path of the Soviet advance, and so he had to hastily evacuate to Nizhny Cherskaya in a panic. Interestingly, after hearing that Soviet tanks had been spotted nearby, Paulus also moved his headquarters in a chaotic rush to the same place because it had good communications. Is this an indication that he was thinking of withdrawing? Werner Hapt says that Hott lost contact with his units and that the 4th Panzer Army was temporarily subordinated to Paulus. And since the Romanians had disintegrated, this was why the 4th Romanian Army wasn't formed on the 21st as originally planned. The Romanian forces to the south of Stalingrad remained under Hott's control, a German army with no German units, just Romanian ones. Looking at the overall picture at the end of the 21st of November 1942, we can see that the situation for the 6th Army had seriously deteriorated. These are the lines at the beginning of the battle, and these are those at the end of the first day, the 19th, and things aren't looking too bad at this point. Even by the end of the 20th, the 6th Army isn't yet in a bad position. There's still more than 120 kilometers between the two Soviet pincers at this point, and so deciding to abandon Stalingrad at this juncture seems premature. It's only really as a result of the huge advances on the 21st, especially on the northern flank, that the situation becomes dire for the 6th Army. Only when the two pincers were about 70 kilometers from each other, and when von Weichs informed Paulus what was happening, did the situation look bad enough for a withdrawal to be considered. It's because of this rapid advance on the 21st that turned the situation from being relatively okay to being a disastrous one. So, by the time that it became obvious that the 6th Army was going to be encircled and that they should maybe consider abandoning the city, events overtook them so quickly that it was too late to react. I would argue that the only time Paulus could have seriously considered abandoning Stalingrad would have been now, on the 21st. Before the late morning of this day, he didn't know that he was about to be encircled, so he couldn't have decided to save the 6th Army before this point. And even if he had reacted instantly and decided to do it, and even if every soldier in the 6th Army just picked up their rifles and started walking, by the time they got to the Don area, they'd have to fight their way out. So it was no longer a case of simply abandoning Stalingrad. By the time the situation deteriorated to the point where a withdrawal could be considered, it was now a breakout operation, not a simple stroll out of the city. It's reported that Zeitzler spoke with Hitler on the evening of the 21st, and he tried to convince the Führer that the 6th Army had to withdraw. Except, Zeitzler was only calling for a withdrawal from the city of Stalingrad to the lower Don and Cher rivers. He wanted to concentrate here so that they could defeat the Soviet spearheads and keep the supply routes open. That's not the same thing as simply abandoning the entire area, and Hitler, with the airlift and relief operations in mind, refused to allow even this, probably because he knew it was too late to do any of that. But the fact that Zeitzler himself wasn't arguing for a complete withdrawal supports the idea that it was too late to simply abandon Stalingrad. Now, some sources have suggested that the airlift operation could have begun on this day, the 21st of November, but Hayward, in his book Stopped at Stalingrad, points out that the weather was terrible and that the Luftwaffe was too busy evacuating their airfields in the face of the Soviet advance, so no airlift could begin at this point. Also, what's the point when the supply lines aren't cut yet? It doesn't really make any sense to argue this. However, Jesenek, Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe, was starting to have doubts about this whole airlift idea. He therefore rang Richthofen to ask him what he thought, and Richthofen told Jesenek that he was wrong, an airlift wasn't possible. "You've got to stop it. In the filthy weather we have here, there's not a hope of supplying an army of 250,000 men from the air. It's stark, staring madness." Yet, so the story goes, when Jesenek went back to tell Hitler that they had to abandon the airlift idea, Hitler stuck to his guns and based all future decisions on Jesenek's initial assertion that the airlift could be accomplished. Or, by the time Jesenek realised that the airlift idea wouldn't work, it was too late. The 6th Army was surrounded, and the only option was to supply it by the air. Hitler therefore insisted on the airlift, since the alternative was not to supply the 6th Army at all, and let it fold within a few days. But discussions about the airlift idea had seeped through the ranks, and when Fiebig telephoned the 6th Army to discuss the situation, Paulus' Chief of Staff, Schmidt, informed him that they were going to form a hedgehog position around Stalingrad and then would receive supplies from the air. Fiebig, who hadn't been told about the airlift idea until now, responded saying that it was impossible to supply an entire army by the air, especially since many of their transport aircraft were busy flying troops to North Africa. Richthofen agreed with Fiebig and wrote in his diary on the 22nd of November that he started to convince as many people as possible that this was a bad idea. Apparently, in addition to Jesenek, he spoke with von Weichs, Zeitzler and even Goering, trying to persuade them all that it couldn't succeed. But again, what other option did they have? Even if it didn't fully work, the airlift would allow the 6th Army to survive for a couple of weeks until Manstein sorted the situation out. It didn't need to work, it just needed to be attempted. The permanent solution would be Manstein's relief operation. So, Richthofen was correct, it wouldn't work, but it had to be done because there was no other option. At Nizhny Cherskaya, Paulus, Schmidt, Pickert, commander of the 8th Flak Division, Hott and his chief of staff, Fangor, all met to discuss the situation. Pickert was asked what he would do, and he said they should immediately break out. Schmidt explained that Hitler had expressly ordered 6th Army to stand fast at Stalingrad, that the army lacked sufficient fuel for a proper breakout attempt, and that the terrain itself complicated matters. The Soviets held higher ground to the west, meaning that 6th Army would be exposed to their guns if they attempted to break out. Such an attempt would have to be made without heavy weapons in any event because of the fuel shortages. Moreover, it would be necessary to leave 15,000 sick and wounded soldiers to their fate. Schmidt added, a breakout would probably turn into a Napoleonic catastrophe. Now, that's not an explanation you hear every day regarding the breakout attempt. Schmidt was definitely in favour of them standing their ground at Stalingrad and awaiting supplies or a break-in operation. So, all these accounts that pinned the blame squarely on Paulus and call him a coward, no, Schmidt provided a decent explanation as to why a breakout could not occur at this time, and that explanation has been dismissed or ignored. The reason why Paulus and Schmidt on this occasion rejected Pickert's and Fiebig's suggestion of an immediate breakout was not that they did not take the risks of supply by air seriously enough, but that a temporary hedgehog seemed to them unavoidable in the army's tactical and logistical position. A breakout was the first choice of the Wehrmacht leadership. Likewise, the first major German operational study of the campaign, written in 1955, recommended it, and it still surfaces in the literature today. It would have been a far more difficult operation than many analysts allow, however. Not only was virtually all of 6th Army's fighting strength embedded in Stalingrad, but the army's supply, fuel and transport situation was bordering on the disastrous. Paulus had long ago sent away the horses, for example, the backbone of 6th Army's transport. But regardless what the army leadership wanted, at the same time, at Gumrak Airfield, inside the forming pocket, Seydlitz summoned the other corps commanders of the 6th Army for a meeting about what should be done. Paulus didn't know about this discussion, but von Weichs did, and they all decided that a breakout should be attempted on the 25th of November, which would be well after they were surrounded. Von Weichs gave the green light to this operation, and this is interesting because at the same time Paulus asked von Weichs for permission to withdraw again, which was refused. Now, before we see Paulus's message, let's look at the map. What forces was Paulus going to use for a breakout attempt? Where's his breakout force? It doesn't exist. He was busy trying to form blocking lines and a hedgehog-style defence in the Stalingrad area, but there was basically nothing in the south at this time that he could use as a breakout force. Worse, there was nothing in the south to even create the defensive line he was trying to create. Paulus was actually concerned that he couldn't form a pocket because his southern front didn't have enough troops. Yet he's expected to make a breakout attempt? Nevertheless, Paulus asked von Weichs if he could have freedom of action to withdraw from Stalingrad if a front could not be created. But Paulus' message is often only partially quoted and is often used to blame Hitler. In reality, Paulus wanted to form a hedgehog around Stalingrad first, and only if he failed to do that would he order his men to break out. It is doubtful whether we can succeed in building a thin line in the south by weakening the strong north front. The Don is frozen solid and can be crossed on foot. Supplies will soon be used up, and tanks and heavy weapons will be immobile. The ammunition situation is strained, and there are enough foodstuffs for 6 days. The army plans to keep up the defence of the area from Stalingrad to the Don and concentrate all its efforts there. Presumably in this way it will be possible to ensure the closure of the southern front and the reception by air of the necessary supplies. We request freedom of action for the armies in case we fail to organise the defence along the southern front. The situation in this case will require to leave Stalingrad and the northern front and to direct all forces against the enemy in the south in order to establish connection with 4th Romanian Army. An offensive in the western direction to Bokhovskaya cannot be considered because of strong enemy forces and difficult terrain. So, contrary to the other accounts, Paulus wasn't wanting to abandon Stalingrad. He would only do so if he failed to establish a pocket, which was the priority. So, fleeing from Stalingrad was viewed as a last resort. Nonetheless, when von Weichs later showed this same message to von Manstein, the conclusion he came to was different. At HQ Army Group B with von Weichs, I was shown a message which General Paulus, the commander of 6th Army, had radioed to Hitler on, to the best of my recollection, 22nd or 23rd of November. It stated that he and all his corps commanders considered it absolutely imperative that the army should break out to the southwest. To raise the forces needed for such an operation, however, he would have to shift certain formations around inside the army and, for the purpose of economizing in troops, take his northern front back on a shorter line. The view taken at Army Group headquarters was that, even if Hitler had given immediate approval, no breakout could have started before 28th of November. There's numerous problems with Manstein's interpretation of Paulus' message. For starters, it's simply not what Paulus' message said. And there's so much going on here that it's worth thinking this through again. So some accounts are saying that Paulus didn't want to break out and was just blindly following Hitler's orders, yet Manstein was saying that he did want to break out, which in reality he didn't. We also have his corps commanders and von Weichs saying that they want to break out and were preparing to do so, which Paulus supposedly didn't know about, but at the same time, Paulus doesn't even have the forces in the south to create a defensive line, let alone mount a breakout attempt. So Paulus needs to shrink his pocket first, which he doesn't want to do, in order to free up some troops so that he could form a southern defensive line, which he wasn't sure was even possible, and then potentially launch a breakout attempt, maybe on the 25th, or as Manstein says, on the 28th of November, in 3 to 6 days' time. The reason it would take some time to prepare was because they would have to actually fight their way out of the pocket. They can't just pick up their rifles and start walking. So this required an organised and planned effort that would take time to prepare. In addition, Schmidt was certain that a breakout attempt couldn't succeed at the moment, which lends credence to the idea that Paulus couldn't mount an immediate breakout attempt and didn't want to do so. And there's nothing to the south of Stalingrad. Nothing. No Axis line at this time. There's basically nothing between the Italian 8th Army and the couple of Romanian cavalry divisions in Hoth's army to the south. For all anyone knew, the front line could have fallen back to Rostov, so ordering a breakout now would have meant they would have been walking for weeks before they even reached friendly lines. It might be worth waiting until someone, let's say Manstein, had formed a new front with fresh reserves and then had started to strike towards the 6th Army before a breakout attempt was made. Gee, I wonder why Hitler refused to allow a breakout attempt. Radio message number 1352, urgent, to Headquarters 6th Army, Führer decision. 6th Army will hold rail line open as long as possible in spite of danger of temporary encirclement. Orders for supply by air will follow. Supposedly, according to Glantz, Paulus and his subordinates at 6th Army were stunned by this decision, contradicting Schmidt's words previously and then doesn't make sense at all given what we've just discussed. Also, some of the sources say that Paulus and his staff didn't actually receive the order because they had been evacuating their headquarters when it was sent, directly contradicting Glantz and some of the other accounts. This makes sense because this order was sent on the 21st, which explains why Paulus kept asking over and over for permission to retreat. He hadn't actually received Hitler's standfast order yet. So perhaps Hitler's order wasn't even a factor in the decision to hold at Stalingrad. Virtually every German commander in southern Russia believed that only an immediate breakout would save 6th Army. Meanwhile, Paulus, a loyal and successful officer of the Third Reich, hesitated to disagree with Hitler. He had been under enormous nervous strain since the Kharkov offensive in May. Now, faced with the crisis of encirclement, he seemed too much in control of himself, too passive, as if he were unwilling to give vent to his concerns. No, Paulus wasn't passive. He and Schmidt looked at the situation and believed it wasn't possible to launch a breakout operation. So rather than just stubbornly sitting at Stalingrad and being wiped out, there was a serious discussion and effort being made to enact a breakout attempt. In the end it didn't happen, but the idea that nervous Paulus alone was just blindly following Madman Hitler's orders is contradicted by these facts. He may not have even received the order from Hitler in which to disobey. Yet, despite saying that no breakout could have started before the 28th of November, Manstein blames Hitler anyway. However, Hitler had turned the request down and forbidden any retraction of the Northern Front. Well, maybe there's a reason for this. The Northern Front had proven to be a decent defensive position, so leaving it when no breakout attempt could be made until the 28th of November doesn't make sense. Evidently, General Paulus did everything possible within the limits of Hitler's order binding him to Stalingrad to extract forces from those of his army fronts which were not so seriously threatened in the first instance. Except Hitler wasn't binding Paulus to Stalingrad, the Red Army was. Why is he blaming Hitler instead of the Soviets? One may say safely that the encirclement of 6th Army could only have been prevented if the latter had attempted a breakout in the very early stages. No, this isn't the case at all. It's far more complicated than Manstein is making it out to be. The onus of ordering it to do so lay with the Supreme Commander. While General Paulus should certainly have taken his own decision to disengage from Stalingrad, he could hardly have done so as early as OKH not being briefed, as the latter was, on the situation in the neighbouring army areas. Yeah, this sentence doesn't make any sense. Is it a bad translation, or just Manstein not writing clearly what he was trying to say? By the 22nd or 23rd of November, when he did ask for permission to break out, the vital hour may already have been missed. He is correct in stating that the vital hour had already been missed. By the 22nd or 23rd of November, no breakout could have been attempted. But he's wrong to suggest that Paulus should have abandoned Stalingrad before it was obvious that his army was in trouble, which is clearly unrealistic. He then blames Hitler and Paulus for this, but again, that's completely unfair. He should be blaming the Red Army for outplaying them, but can't do that because his National Socialism prevents him from admitting that the Soviets had actually beaten the glorious German army. There's another aspect to this too. Manstein has explained that the breakout attempt requested on the 22nd couldn't have been started until the 28th of November, 6 days later. So even if Paulus had miraculously understood at the start of Operation Uranus on the 19th of November that his army was going to be encircled and had reacted instantly, it would have taken him 6 days to prepare that breakout operation. That breakout operation wouldn't have started until the 25th of November, after the encirclement had been complete. So by the time that Operation Uranus was launched, The vital hour was already long gone. If Paulus was to have successfully withdrawn from Stalingrad, he would have had to have abandoned Stalingrad before Operation Uranus was launched, meaning that he needed to have known for certain that Operation Uranus was going to be launched, would have been successful, and would have encircled his army, none of which he could have known. In other words, the argument that most historians agree with, that Paulus was passive and should have abandoned Stalingrad, is completely unrealistic. Manstein then goes on to say that Paulus didn't dare question Hitler, that he was too loyal to the Führer, and that Hitler was too closely bound to Stalingrad due to his own reputation and prestige. And even though others have repeated this narrative, it's completely false. It had nothing to do with prestige or Paulus lacking the guts to challenge Hitler. I have a video on the Stalingrad propaganda idea, and that seriously calls into question the prestige issue, and Paulus could have only launched a breakout after it was too late for one to succeed, by Manstein's own words. And since he had to stay in Stalingrad, that wasn't Hitler's fault, or Paulus's fault, or anyone else's fault. It was simply the reality of the situation. The events, and the Soviets, had overtaken Paulus before he could reasonably act. The only question then is, why do some of these accounts say that Hitler and Paulus are to blame? Well, they're either trying to put all the blame on Hitler to paint him as a madman, which lets them off the hook for their own mistakes at other times, or they're trying to blame Paulus as a way to let themselves off the hook. Surely the army group commander, von Weichs, is to blame for the 6th Army's encirclement, since 2 of his armies, one German, one Romanian, had collapsed under his watch. But no, von Weichs is never the focus of the debate. It's always Paulus. Neither is Hot. His army collapsed as well. 1.5 of his corps, including all his German divisions, ended up in the pocket, but he's never blamed for this. No one says that he should have withdrawn from Stalingrad prior to Operation Uranus. And the reason why is because pointing the finger at Paulus and Hitler lets numerous other generals off the hook, and takes the emphasis off the Soviets. It's not that the Soviets won, it's that the Germans lost. Lost victories, as Manstein's book is called. That's what's happening here. But that narrative is wrong. The Soviets won and the Germans lost. And while the German generals could have done things differently and maybe performed better, they were simply outclassed by the Red Army. But since they can't admit that, or place the blame on the army commander von Weichs, or on Hot, or anyone else, the fault must lie with Madman Hitler and nervous Paulus. So this is a very simple case of none of the German generals wanting to take responsibility for what happened, or granting the Red Army a victory which they rightly earned. Well, they're not getting away with it this time. More events occurred on the 22nd of November regarding the airlift problem and the ground warfare too, but we'll have to hear about them next time. If you haven't seen my video on the German propaganda efforts at Stalingrad, and whether Hitler was as obsessed with Stalingrad as is often claimed, check out this video right here. Thanks for watching, bye for now.